To Sports Live Media on YouTube. It's you guys, Sports Live broadcasting live today, March 5th, 2026. Today we are doing Inside the Diamond college baseball and college softball picks. Normally this stream is on Friday, but due to some early commitments tomorrow, we're going to go ahead and do it today on Thursday. This live stream normally will take place on Fridays, but will again take place today due to some early commitments and stuff. So we are at season one, episode three, and I'm going to go through and just mention who is playing baseball and softball. All games that will be discussed will be taking place tomorrow, March 6th, and I'll just go over who is playing the baseball games, and then I'll make my picks based on a page by page basis. So we'll start with college baseball for tomorrow. Carolina, Eastern Illinois versus Belmarine, and Binghamton versus Richmond. In this selection, I'm going to go Maine defeats Dayton, Northwestern defeats South Dakota State, Georgetown defeats George Mason, Western Carolina will defeat Radford, Richmond will defeat Binghamton, Eastern Illinois will defeat Bellarmine. Next, you have Army West Point versus VCU. You have Cornell versus Fordham. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? You have Iona versus Mount St. Mary's. You have Rhode, Central Michigan versus Ball State, Columbia versus West Virginia, Monmouth versus Towson, Northeastern versus Stony Brook, St. Joseph's versus Bucknell, Charleston team versus Hofstra, Fairfield versus Siena, UConn versus Old Dominion, FDU versus Wagner, Yale versus George Washington, Bowling Green versus Kent State. So in those games, I have Army defeating VCU, Fordham defeating Cornell, Iona defeating Mount St. Mary's, Akron will defeat Western Michigan, Rhode Island will defeat Brown, Ball State will defeat Central Michigan, will defeat Towson, West Virginia will defeat Columbia, Northeastern will defeat Stony Brook, Bucknell will defeat St. Joseph's, Fairfield will defeat Siena, Charleston will lose to Hofstra, Old Dominion defeats UConn, Yale will defeat George Washington. Today. All right, next on the college baseball games for tomorrow, we have App State versus Presbyterian, New Haven versus Stonehill, Alabama A&M versus UNC Asheville, Eastern Michigan versus Miami and Ohio, Morehead State versus Butler, Western Illinois versus VMI, Niagara versus Merrimack, Manhattan versus Marist, UMES versus Central Connecticut State, Middle Tennessee versus UAB, Quinnipiac versus UNC Greensboro, Massachusetts versus Toledo, University of Albany versus St. John's in New York, Queens and North Carolina versus Georgia, Lehigh versus Davidson, Mercyhurst versus Coppin State. In these set of games, I have Appalachian State defeating Presbyterian, New Haven, Niagara versus Merrimack, or will defeat Merrimack, Marist will defeat Manhattan, UMES will defeat Central Connecticut State, UAB defeats Middle Tennessee, Quinnipiac will defeat UNC Greensboro, Toledo will defeat Massachusetts, University of Albany will defeat St. John's of New York, Georgia will defeat Queens and North Carolina, Lehigh will defeat Davidson, and Mercyhurst. All right, next we have Norfolk State versus LIU. We have Lemoyne versus Delaware State. Harvard versus Liberty. Southeast Missouri State versus Milwaukee. Oregon versus Purdue. Lafayette versus NC State. Memphis versus Missouri State. UC Davis versus UC Riverside. Sanford versus Kennesaw State. St. Thomas, Minnesota versus Kansas. Radford versus Charlotte. UC San Diego versus Cincinnati. LaSalle versus Clemson. In those games, I have LIU defeating Norfolk State. Lemoyne defeating Delaware State to Harvard. Seton Hall loses to Louisville. Southeast Missouri State will win over Milwaukee. Oregon will defeat Purdue. NC State will defeat Lafayette. Memphis will defeat Missouri State. UC Riverside will defeat UC Davis. Samford will win over Kennesaw State. St. Thomas in Minnesota loses to Kansas. Radford will defeat Charlotte. Let's see. Cincinnati will defeat UC San Diego. LaSalle will defeat Clemson. And hello to you, Evil Larry. How are you today? Glad to see you here today. College baseball games that we have. All right, here we go. We have NC State, we have North Carolina A&T versus Elon. We have Southern Illinois versus Omaha. Virginia Tech versus Georgia Tech. ETSU versus James Madison. NIU versus Ohio. West Georgia versus Wichita State. Austin Peay versus Utah Tech. Lipscomb versus Mississippi State. Wofford versus Belmont. Bradley versus St. Louis. Youngstown State versus Southern Indiana. SIUE versus Kansas State. Washington versus Indiana. And William and Mary versus Campbell. In these games, I have Elon defeating North Carolina A&T. I have Southern Illinois defeating Omaha. Georgia Tech will defeat Virginia Tech. James Madison loses to ETSU. The University of Ohio wins over NIU. West Georgia will defeat Wichita State. Utah Tech will defeat Austin Peay. Lipscomb will defeat Mississippi. Wofford will defeat Belmont. St. Louis will defeat Bradley. Youngstown State will defeat Southern Indiana. Kansas State will defeat SIUE. Washington will defeat Indiana. And Campbell will win over William and Mary. Georgia State, we have Lindenwood versus Iowa. Murray State versus UCF. Alcorn versus Mercer. East Carolina versus Coastal Carolina. Gardner-Webb versus Oklahoma State. Jacksonville versus UNCW. Stanford versus Wake Forest. St. Peter's versus NJIT. St. Bonaventure versus Marshall. Northern Kentucky versus Florida State. Northern Colorado versus Utah Valley. In those games, I have Dartmouth defeating Navy. Duke defeating Notre Dame. Charleston will defeat Georgia State. Lindenwood will defeat will lose to Iowa, sorry. UCF will defeat Murray State. Alcorn will defeat will lose to Mercer, sorry. Coastal Carolina will defeat East Carolina. Oklahoma State will defeat Gardner-Webb. Jacksonville will defeat UNCW. Stanford will defeat Wake Forest. St. Peter's will beat NJIT. Marshall will defeat St. Bonaventure. State will defeat Northern Kentucky. Northern Colorado will defeat Utah Valley. All right, next set of baseball games. We have Pittsburgh versus San Jose State, Tennessee Tech versus Georgia Southern, Wright State versus Tennessee, Maryland versus Troy, Little Rock versus Central Arkansas, North Alabama versus Southern Miss, Louisiana Tech versus South Alabama, Valparaiso versus Jacksonville State, Grambling versus Southeastern Louisiana, Gonzaga versus Creighton, Washington State versus Texas State, Stetson versus Arkansas, North Florida versus Alabama, Houston Christian versus McNeese, Rice versus Abilene Christian, ULM versus UT Arlington. In those games, which will take place tomorrow, I have San Jose State defeating Pittsburgh. I have Georgia Southern defeating Tennessee Tech. Wright State will beat will lose to Tennessee, sorry. I have Troy defeating Maryland. Central Arkansas will defeat Little Rock. Southern Miss will defeat North Alabama. South Alabama will defeat Louisiana Tech. Jacksonville State will defeat Valparaiso. Southeastern Louisiana will defeat Grambling. Creighton will defeat Gonzaga. Texas State will defeat Washington State. Arkansas will defeat Stetson. Alabama will defeat North Florida. McNeese will defeat Houston Christian. Abilene Christian will defeat Rice. UT Arlington will defeat ULM. Next, in the next set of games, we have Boston College versus Miami in Florida, Longwood versus Alabama State, Oakland versus Texas A&M, Arkansas State versus Oral Roberts, UIC versus Missouri, FGCU versus Bethune-Cookman, Long Beach State versus UC Santa Barbara, and hello to you, Allie. Greatly appreciate you joining me today. Sacramento State versus LSU, Evansville versus Ole Miss, Penn State versus Texas Tech, New Orleans versus UTRGV, Arkansas Pine Bluff versus Houston, Santa Clara versus Oklahoma, Air Force versus Baylor, USC Upstate versus Texas, Prairie View versus Sam Houston. In those games for tomorrow, I have Boston College defeating Miami and Florida, Longwood defeating Alabama State, Oakland defeating Texas A&M, Arkansas State defeating Oral Roberts, Missouri losing to UIC, FGCU will defeat Bethune-Cookman, Long Beach State will beat Santa Barbara, Sacramento State will defeat LSU, Evansville defeats Ole Miss, Texas Tech loses to Penn State, New Orleans will defeat UTRGV, Arkansas Pine Bluff will beat Houston, Santa Clara defeats Oklahoma, Air Force defeats Baylor, USC Upstate defeats Texas, Prairie View defeats... Okay, we got that done. Next set of baseball games that we have Nichols versus Texas A&M, Corpus Christi versus DBU, Grand Canyon versus Utah, UTSA versus New Mexico State, Tarleton State versus New Mexico, Fresno State versus Arizona, UNLV versus Minnesota, Austin Peay versus Utah Tech, Xavier versus Oregon State, Eason versus UC Irvine, St. Mary's in California versus San Diego State, Illinois versus Southern California, Holy Cross versus Portland, Pacific versus Nevada, San Diego versus California, Cal State Fullerton versus CSU Bakersfield. So in those set of games, I have Nichols defeating Texas A&M and Corpus Christi. I have DBU defeating Louisiana, Utah losing to Grand Canyon, UTSA losing to New Mexico State, Tarleton State defeats New Mexico, Arizona will defeat Fresno State, UNLV will defeat Minnesota, Utah Tech will defeat Austin Peay, Oregon State will defeat Xavier, CSUN will defeat UC Irvine, St. Mary's in California will defeat San Diego State, Illinois will defeat Southern California, Holy Cross will defeat Portland, Pacific defeats Nevada, San Diego loses to California, Cal State Fullerton defeats CSU Bakersfield. Now, let's go with the next group of games. You have LMU in California versus Arizona State, Cal Poly versus Hawaii, Tulane versus TCU, Northwestern State versus UIW, High Point versus Florida, Delaware versus Canisius, Indiana State versus Western Kentucky, California Baptist versus BYU, the Citadel versus Kentucky, Lamar University versus GFA, Michigan versus Pepperdine, Winthrop versus Auburn, Rider versus Sacred Heart, Michigan State versus Nebraska, Mississippi Valley versus UT Martin, Jackson State versus Seattle. In that set of games, I have Tulane defeats TCU, Northwestern State defeats UIW, High Point will defeat Florida, Canisius will defeat Delaware, will lose to Delaware, Indiana State will lose to Western Kentucky, California Baptist will defeat BYU, the Citadel will lose to Kentucky, GFA will win over Lamar University, Pepperdine defeats Michigan, Auburn will defeat Winthrop, Rider will defeat Sacred Heart, Michigan State will defeat Nebraska, Mississippi Valley will defeat UT Martin, and Jackson State will defeat Seattle University. Again, welcome to the program, Alley for Success, Evil, Larry, and James. Thank you very much for joining me today. We have a few more baseball games to go over for tomorrow. You have North Dakota State versus Vanderbilt, Villanova versus Florida A&M, FIU versus Florida Atlantic, Southern University versus South Florida. In those games, I have Vanderbilt defeating North Dakota State, Villanova defeating Florida A&M, Florida Atlantic defeating FIU, and South Florida defeating Southern University. Now, we're done with the baseball games for tomorrow. Let's look at the college softball games for tomorrow, and I'll make my picks just like I did with baseball. All right. So these games will take place tomorrow, just like in baseball. So we have Northwestern versus Washington, IU Indy versus Miami and Ohio, Bryant versus Michigan, Lafayette versus Lemoyne. You have Penn versus Ohio, Bellarmine versus LIU, And you have UMass Lowell versus Central Connecticut, and Stetson versus Michigan State. I have Stetson defeating Michigan State. I have UMass Lowell defeating Central Connecticut State. I have Washington defeating Northwestern. Miami and Ohio will defeat IU Indy. Michigan will defeat Bryant. Lafayette defeats Lamar. Ohio will defeat Penn. Bellarmine will defeat LIU. All right, next set of games. We have New Mexico versus Mississippi State. Central Michigan versus USC Upstate. FDU versus North Dakota. University of Albany versus Syracuse. Drake versus Kansas City. Tarleton State versus Texas A&M. Campbell versus Hampton. Notre Dame versus Grand Canyon. Canisius versus Akron. Niagara versus Lehigh. LMU in California versus Utah Tech. Southern Utah versus Maine. Western Michigan versus Butler. LIU versus Louisville, and then Ohio versus Robert Morris, and Youngstown State versus Lemoyne. So in those games, I have New Mexico defeating Mississippi State, Central Michigan defeating USC Upstate, North Dakota will defeat FDU, Syracuse will defeat the University of Albany, Drake defeats Kansas City, Texas A&M will defeat Tarleton State, Campbell will defeat Hampton, Notre Dame will defeat Grand Canyon, Canisius will defeat Akron, Niagara will defeat Lehigh. Utah Tech will defeat Utah Tech will defeat LMU in California. Maine will defeat Southern Utah. Butler will defeat Western Michigan. Louisville will defeat LIU. Ohio will defeat Robert Morris, and Youngstown State will defeat Lemoyne. All right, the next set of games, we have Northern Kentucky versus Miami and Ohio. We have UMass Lowell versus Towson. We have Toledo versus Army of West Point. Central Michigan versus USC Upstate. Mercer versus Stetson. Radford versus Bryant. Georgia Southern versus Presbyterian. Oregon State versus Nevada. FDU versus Holy Cross. Bradley versus Indiana State. Georgia State versus ETSU. Radford versus Penn State. University of Albany versus Morgan State. California Baptist versus St. Thomas in Minnesota. Drake versus Colorado State. UNI versus Murray State. In these games, I have Miami of Ohio defeating Northern Kentucky. Towson defeating UMass Lowell. Army of West Point will defeat Toledo. Central Michigan will defeat USC Upstate. Radford loses to Bryant. Georgia Southern will defeat Presbyterian. Oregon State will to Nevada. FDU loses to Holy Cross. Bradley will defeat Indiana State. Georgia State will defeat ETSU. Penn State will defeat Radford. Morgan State will defeat the University of Albany. St. Thomas in Minnesota will defeat California Baptist. Drake will defeat Colorado State. And Murray State will defeat UNI. All right, next you have UConn versus St. John's in New York. You have Villanova versus DePaul. UIC versus Belmont. Butler versus Austin Peay. Texas Southern versus Grambling. Creighton versus Seton Hall. Utah State versus Kansas. Texas A&M versus St. Francis. New Mexico versus Samford. Binghamton versus Niagara. St. Bonaventure versus Green Bay. LMU in California versus North Dakota State. Georgia State versus Winthrop. UMES versus Drexel. Penn versus Western Carolina. North Dakota versus Norfolk State. Southern Utah versus Idaho State, and Bethune-Cookman versus Alabama A&M. In those games, I have UConn defeating St. John's of New York. Villanova will defeat DePaul, or will lose to DePaul, sorry. Belmont will win over UIC. Austin Peay defeats Butler. Grambling will defeat Texas Southern. Creighton will defeat Seton Hall. Kansas will defeat Utah State. Texas A&M will defeat St. Francis. New Mexico will defeat Samford. Niagara will defeat Binghamton. Green Bay will defeat St. Bonaventure. LMU in California loses to North Dakota State. Winthrop will defeat Georgia State. Drexel will defeat UMES. Penn will defeat Western Carolina. North Dakota defeats Norfolk State. Southern Utah will defeat Idaho State. Bethune-Cookman beats Alabama A&M. And again, these games are tomorrow, so yeah. All right, next set of games. We have Northern Kentucky versus Miami and Ohio. UMass Lowell versus Towson. I think I've already gone over these. No, I have not. Okay. You have Toledo versus Army West Point. Central Michigan versus USC Upstate. Mercer versus Stetson. Bryant versus Radford. Georgia Southern versus Presbyterian. Nevada. Yes, I've already gone over those. I apologize. All right, next set of games that we have for tomorrow. For tomorrow. We have IU Indy versus Delaware State, South Dakota versus Northern Colorado, Valparaiso versus Southern Illinois, Stony Brook versus Hofstra, Akron versus Marshall, Bradley versus Indiana State, Lemoyne versus Longwood, Georgetown versus Providence, Bella Marine versus Ball State, Central Connecticut State versus Towson, Stetson versus NC State, Army West Point versus UNC Greensboro, Furman versus App State, Boston College versus James Madison, Sacramento State versus Nevada, Georgia Southern versus Jacksonville. I'm going to go over the games on this whole page and then go over my picks at that point. You have Illinois State versus Evansville, Michigan State versus NC State, Penn State versus Boston College, Mississippi State versus South Alabama,